Welcome to Radnor Library. I am Lynn Elson, Vice President of the Radnor Historical Society, and this is being presented by the Radnor Historical Society, Radnor Library, and Maine Coin Books. First Lady of World War II, Eleanor Roosevelt, Daring Journey to the Front Lines and Back. That is what we're covering in the book. And the book is by Shannon McKenna Schmidt.
Your friend.
She is a writer and a traveler, and she has written for National Geographic Traveler, NPR.org, and more. In 2010 and 17, she traveled full-time and backpacked around the world. When not traveling, she lives in Hoboken, New Jersey. Like Frank Sinatra. The books can be purchased with mainline book table in the back. The First Lady of World War II is the first book to tell the story of Eleanor Roosevelt's unprecedented and courageous trip to the Pacific Theater while the United States was at war with Japan. Goodwill tour, diplomatic mission, and fact-finding foray. The 25,000-mile trip was farther, longer, and more dangerous than any previously undertaken by a First Lady. So, welcome to our event.
Thank you. And thank you all so much for coming tonight to hear about the First Lady of World War II, the truly extraordinary Eleanor Roosevelt. In August 1943, the United States had been at war with Japan for nearly 2 years. One night, a military transport plane, traveling under the code name Flight 321, left San Francisco bound for the Pacific Theater. Inside the plane, it was bare bones, it was loud and rumbling, it was freezing cold. On board, sharing space with supplies and sacks of mail, was First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. And by the time Eleanor set out for the Pacific, she had been First Lady for a decade. And she was famous for her travels, or infamous, depending on the perspective. And she constantly made headlines for them. And when Eleanor entered the White House in 1933, the American public got a First Lady the likes of which they had never seen before. Traditionally, First Ladies stayed close to the White House, they primarily oversaw social functions, and they did not take an active part in public life. But at the time Eleanor became First Lady, she was already well established in her own right. She was an educator, a political advocate, she was a writer, a speaker, and a traveler. And Eleanor was an early advocate of commercial air travel. And this was at a time when it was thought that only the most courageous and athletic people were fit to fly. And she was friends with Amelia Earhart, and she wanted to be a pilot herself. And this was not a woman who was going to be grounded at the White House. And Eleanor created for herself a unique role that combined her love of travel, her wanderlust, with her sense of social responsibility. And she decided that she could best help her husband, the president, by being his eyes and ears, his listening post, by keeping him in touch with public opinion, which she said is the moving force in a democracy. And she ceaselessly crisscrossed the country, inspecting New Deal initiatives, giving speeches, seeing and meeting people, and gathering information. And that information she used to exact change, either through her own means or by providing it to the president and his policy advisors. And 1 year into his presidency, FDR asked Eleanor to go to Puerto Rico to investigate labor and living conditions. And the fact that she took a flight over water cemented her reputation as fearless and unconventional. And around that time, she was featured on the cover of this general interest magazine in 1934 and declared America's most traveled First Lady. And as First Lady, Eleanor averaged an astounding 40,000 miles on the road each year, including a previous wartime trip to Great Britain in 1942. And yet, even for such an experienced traveler like Eleanor, the trip to the Pacific was further, longer, more arduous, and more dangerous than anything she had previously done. And in all, she traveled 25,000 miles over the course of 5 weeks to Hawaii, Australia, New Zealand, through the South Pacific, and into territories still under enemy air attack. And Eleanor predicted that the Pacific trip would cost her deeply, both physically and mentally. And in fact, this turned out to be true. Early on in the research process, I came across something that she wrote 6 years after her trip to the Pacific, and in an autobiography, and she said, "The Pacific trip is the mark from which I think I shall never be free." And I found that statement so powerful and so haunting, and the fact that she wrote it years later, and it really compelled me to uncover what she experienced during her 5 weeks in the Pacific. So why did she do it? Why did she commit herself to such an arduous undertaking? Eleanor was enormously driven to contribute to the war effort, and she especially felt a sense of obligation to a generation of young men being sent into battle. And a primary reason for the trip was to thank U.S. troops for their service, thank them herself and on behalf of the President, and to build morale. And in all, she addressed about 400,000 troops throughout the 5-week trip. And the trip was also an informal diplomatic mission to Allied nations, Australia and New Zealand, and to see the war work that women were doing in those countries. And Eleanor added even more onto her plate by going as a representative of the American Red Cross and inspecting the organization's facilities in the region. And she packed no civilian clothing, and she wore only the Red Cross uniforms during the entire trip, even to diplomatic functions. And this pared down her clothing and helped her adhere to a strict luggage limit. And furthermore, the trip occurred at a crucial time in the war. In the summer of 1943, the tide of the war was turning in the Allies' favor in both Europe and the Pacific. And Eleanor felt that people were becoming overly optimistic about the war's outcome, and even that they were becoming dangerously complacent. There were strikes at war production factories across the country. People were complaining about food rationing and shortages. And the trip would link the home front and the fighting front, and remind the nation that they could not let up on their duties until after the war was won, and that any slackening in production risked the lives of the men on distant battlefields. And frankly, winning the war was the only way that their loved ones were going to come home. So for security reasons, the trip was kept secret for the first 10 days as Eleanor made her way from island to island through the South Pacific. And her first inspection stop was Christmas Island, a speck of land so tiny that she wondered why like a large wave didn't just wash it away. And rumors were running rampant among the GIs on Christmas Island. They had noticed that heightened security measures were being put in place, and they were speculating that somebody important might be coming to visit them. They thought it might be a troop of chorus girls, or the politician Wendell Willkie, who had recently made an around-the-world tour and written a best-selling book about it. They were expecting a VIP, and yet they were astounded when Eleanor Roosevelt stepped off the plane. And FDR specifically asked Eleanor to visit Christmas Island and other islands along the supply and communications route that linked the United States with Australia. And it was vital to keep the route open and protected, and yet the men on these islands felt like they were marginalized and distant from the fighting, and as if they weren't making enough of a contribution to the war. And FDR wanted Eleanor to assure them that he knew the vital job that they were doing. And on Christmas Island, Eleanor set the rigorous pace that she would keep throughout the trip. After she got back, she was giving a speech about the trip, and an audience member asked her how many hours of sleep she got per night. She responded that she could get by on 5, but that she didn't always get them. So she went nonstop for 5 weeks, sleeping on army cots and rustic huts, traveling by rough terrain to reach isolated camps, climbing a lookout tower on Christmas Island, dining in mess halls, and walking miles and miles of hospital ports. And she inspected everything from laundry rooms to artillery headquarters to a dentist tent in the Australian outback where a serviceman was having a tooth removed without making a sound. And he said afterward, "It hurt like hell, but with Mrs. Roosevelt watching, I had to act tough." Eleanor took every opportunity to speak with servicemen, finding out what they wanted and what they needed now and after the war. And Eleanor was an expert at fact-gathering. During her visit to Great Britain, an American reporter wrote in a London newspaper that the best thing to do with Eleanor was to go through the necessary formalities and then just turn her loose. Because she could be depended upon to see everything there was to see and meet everyone worth meeting. And in Bora Bora, instead of breakfasting as expected in the officers' mess, she ate with the enlisted men and surprised down the ranks by doing this. So not only is the First Lady in an active theater of war, she's reporting to the President and the home front while she's there. And during her decade as First Lady, Eleanor had built up an extensive network of outlets that she used to communicate with the American public. She held her famous women-only press conferences. She gave speeches across the country, radio addresses, and she wrote a 6-day-a-week syndicated newspaper column called My Day. And the strict luggage limit that I mentioned earlier, part of the reason that she pared down her wardrobe by bringing only the uniforms was because she loved a heavy manual typewriter with her to the Pacific so that she could keep writing My Day in real time, and she wired the copy to her editor in New York. And Eleanor also used My Day to help maintain the secrecy of the trip. For the first 10 days of the trip, she had pre-written columns, and the byline listed her location as being in Hyde Park, New York. So Eleanor continued to make her way through the South Pacific until she reached the island of New Caledonia, where she ran into a roadblock. And that roadblock was Admiral William Halsey, who was the commander of the South Pacific Forces, and the man who would decide whether or not Eleanor was allowed to visit the island of Guadalcanal, which was her ultimate goal of the trip.
Yes.
And Admiral Halsey was not pleased to have Eleanor in the Pacific. He had nothing against her personally. He liked her. He admired her. What he didn't like were VIPs coming through his area and taking his focus away from the war. And especially because he thought that these trips were political gestures or superficial PR junkets. They were all very practical reasons that he objected, along with the fact that he would have to put on a tie. When Eleanor arrived at his headquarters, Admiral Halsey brusquely shut down the suggestion of her going to Guadalcanal, telling her, "Guadalcanal is no place for you, ma'am." He did make a slight concession, saying that he would wait to make his final decision until after Eleanor traveled through Australia and New Zealand and returned to his headquarters. And he would see what the status was of a current battle that he was overseeing and whether he had fighter planes available to escort her into Guadalcanal. Eleanor was devastated at this immediate shutting down of her request to visit Guadalcanal. And she left for New Zealand in low spirits because she thought that given this initial reception that there was no way that Admiral Halsey was going to allow her to go to Guadalcanal. After 10 days of secrecy, Eleanor landed in New Zealand and news broke about the trip. There wasn't so much surprise that she turned up on the other side of the world, but that it had been such a well-kept secret. And Eleanor was familiar to New Zealanders and Australians because of news coverage during her time as First Lady. And Eleanor was a presence on the global stage during World War II. She was asked to make morale-raising radio addresses to women in Sweden, France, Brazil, and other countries. And a New Zealand newspaper called Eleanor a great fighter in the cause of the world's freedom. And they were particularly impressed because she was perhaps the only woman at whom Hitler screamed his denunciations. And for years, Eleanor had been publicly speaking out against Hitler and Nazi aggression. And the Nazis noticed. A German newspaper threatened her by name. And Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, wrote in his diary, "Mrs. Roosevelt is shooting her mouth off around the country. If she were my wife, it would be a different story." Eleanor didn't care. She didn't care about any of that. She was not threatened by them rattling their sabers at her. So Eleanor's visit to Australia and New Zealand was a historic event, and it generated a level of excitement that was on par with royalty. and with a notable difference. They loved her informality. And the Australian newspapers especially cheered whenever she broke the protocol. Like when she arrived at a government building in Australia and she broke away from the official party to walk across the grounds to talk with some women who were in uniform. And they were part of the Women's Land Army, which was created during wartime to address labor shortages in the agricultural sector. And Eleanor was a little frustrated in Australia because everywhere that she went, she had an entourage of U.S. Army officers following her around wherever she went. And one day at a hospital, she came to the bed of a serviceman, and he handed her a long letter. And she took out her glasses, she put them on, and she read the entire thing. And she could see that he was distressed, this young man. And she asked everyone, medical personnel, reporters, high-ranking Army officers, get in the corridor. And she spoke to this young man alone for quite a while. And I just love how this instance illustrates Eleanor's caring about the servicemen, about everyone really, on an individual level. So after leaving Australia, Eleanor went off the grid again for security reasons. They changed the flight number. She returned to Admiral Halsey's headquarters, where she received some great news. She was going to Guadalcanal. So why the change of heart on Admiral Halsey's part? Ultimately, Eleanor won his support not by making arguments, but by the power of her example. And they had spent some time together the first time that she was on New Caledonia. And then, along with reports from other military personnel in the region and the tremendous amount of press coverage that the trip received, he saw that her motivation was genuine. And that this trip was no superficial PR junket. Eleanor Roosevelt was the real deal. And allowing her to go to Guadalcanal was a gesture of his respect for her. And Admiral Halsey was also shrewd. If all went well while Eleanor was on Guadalcanal, it would generate good publicity. And you needed good publicity to keep public approval high for the war and to keep funding flowing. But ultimately, what it came down to, and why I think he allowed her to go to Guadalcanal, is that morale wins wars. And he could see the uplifting effect that her presence had on the troops. Here is this rough, tough, gruff admiral, and he said that what he marveled at most were the expressions on the men's faces as Eleanor leaned over them in their hospital beds. He said most people came through his area, glanced into a sun parlor at a hospital, and left. Eleanor, meanwhile, went bed to bed comforting the wounded. And Admiral Halsey knew the importance of that. When he took over command of Guadalcanal, he visited the front lines as soon as he could. And on his way back to his headquarters, he stopped at another island and at a naval hospital went bed to bed speaking with injured servicemen. And it not only buoyed their morale, it buoyed the morale of the men on Guadalcanal when they heard about it. And Eleanor even went a step further. A practice she began in Great Britain was to keep logbooks of the wounded servicemen that she met. She recorded each person's name, his injuries, such as the one on the bottom, gunshot wound to the face and a ruptured eye, where he received the injuries, and the name and address of a family member for her to contact after her return home. And she did contact the families. You know, letters took weeks to get to the Pacific and back. And to have recent first-hand news of your loved one from the First Lady of the United States was pretty extraordinary. Although Eleanor called one serviceman's girlfriend and she hung up on her because she didn't believe it was the First Lady. So now Admiral Halsey is fully on board with Eleanor's visit to Guadalcanal, and any misgivings he still had were solely out of concern for her safety. Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands was the site of the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific War, and visiting there was a tribute that Eleanor felt she owed to the men in uniform, to see where so many of them had lost their lives or received their injuries. And the war was personal for her. She had 4 sons in various branches of the military, one of whom was a Marine who fought in the Solomon Islands campaign. So in the early morning hours, under cover of darkness, Eleanor left for Guadalcanal in a heavily gunned Navy bomber. turns out, Admiral Halsey's concerns about her safety were warranted. Guadalcanal was bombed several nights before and after her visit. And it actually led Admiral Halsey to speculate whether the Japanese also had code breakers. So with the manual typewriter that Eleanor hauled around the Pacific, she also kept a diary that was shared in installments with the president. And here she describes an air raid alert that sounded while she was on Guadalcanal. And along with the hospital staff and the ambulatory patients, she was taken into an underground shelter, and they all had to wait until the all clear sounded. The danger associated with the trip didn't faze Eleanor. Even traveling in a military transport plane for 5 weeks was risky, as they weren't the most reliable aircraft. And on Eleanor's return home, the planned route was changed at the last minute because of reports of Japanese aircraft in the area for retaliatory raids. Eleanor had courage in spades, and as I said, the danger didn't concern her. What greatly impacted her was the massive scale of suffering that she witnessed. She said that one sees the results of the war in the hospitals. And she was very forthright when reporting to the American public. In a radio address after her return from the Pacific, she told of a young man that she met in a first-line hospital who was so recently injured that he was still in the set of bandages from when he fell in battle. And all he had to his name was a Red Cross comfort kit, and yet he was in a lot of pain, and yet he still managed to smile and thank the people who were helping him. And in that same address, she told people to stop complaining about food rationing and shortages, because it was nothing compared to lying on your back in a jungle swamp while an enemy camouflaged in the trees took shots at you. In another speech, she recalled the shadowed eyes of the men who had endured the savagery of jungle warfare. As Eleanor had predicted, the trip took a huge physical and emotional toll on her. She lost 30 pounds while she was overseas, and when she returned home, she fell into a deep depression. A close friend of hers explained it by saying, as long as she had to keep going, her iron will carried her through, in spite of her deep horror at what she saw and the great sadness at the continued bloodshed and dying. And as Time magazine pointed out, no other U.S. mother had seen so much of the panorama of the war, had been closer to the sweat and boredom, the suffering. And yet the Pacific trip made Eleanor more determined than ever to work hard, to see the war through, and to strive for peace so that this kind of carnage never happened again. And a near-term goal was to see a support program established for returning servicemen. During all of the conversations that Eleanor had with servicemen in mess halls and Red Cross clubs throughout the Pacific, the things she heard most were that they needed supplies to win the war, and they wanted opportunities for jobs and education after they returned home. And Eleanor used the power of her public platform to help ensure that this was done by bringing pressure to bear on Congress, because legislation needed to be passed now and not after the war ended, both to assist the great number of servicemen who were already returning and to boost the morale of the men on the battlefields. As a soldier explained to Eleanor, and she shared this in my day, they weren't afraid of being killed or maimed. What they were afraid of is that when they finally came home and started to piece their lives back together, that they would be made to feel like suckers for the sacrifices that they had made. And the GI Bill of Rights was signed into law the next year. Due to the concern about the retaliatory raids on Eleanor's way home, the transport plane was detoured to Christmas Island, where Eleanor had begun the trip weeks earlier. And when the inevitable controversy arose over the trip, because everything Eleanor did generated controversy, the soldiers on Christmas Island took on Eleanor's detractors in their troop publication. And a GI journalist reported, her kindness and consideration brought this island of forgotten men very much back to life. It takes great courage to do what Mrs. Roosevelt is now doing, and you have to hand it to her. She has what it takes. The First Lady of World War II presents Eleanor Roosevelt in a lesser-known light as an adventurer and a traveler. And yet the Pacific trip also exemplifies so much of what is admired about Eleanor: her courage, her compassion, her connecting with people, her crusading for a better world. and it shows how important her leadership was during World War II. A reporter at the time described Eleanor's trip to the Pacific, and I believe this still stands, as the most remarkable journey any president's wife has ever made.
Earlier on, you showed her uniform. It looked like it was in a museum.
Yes. Yes, excellent point. That uniform is on display at the FDR Presidential Library and Museum in Hyde Park.
Thank you so much. What was the president's attitude towards her?
You know, FDR was a huge supporter of her travels. I think that he knew that this was something that, everyone, he was very supportive. He knew that this was something that she needed and wanted to do personally, and also he benefited from it. You know, he boasted in a cabinet meeting once about her travels. You know, he said, "My missus travels a lot," you know, and he was enormously proud of her ability to connect with people. So yes, a lot of the times, you know, he benefited in his administration from the information. Because, you know, we'll give FDR his due. I mean, at the time, she wouldn't have been able to do a lot of what she did. You know, even a woman traveling alone at that time without her husband was, you know, scandalous and shocking. And he actually received a telegram. So a couple from Atlanta telegram the president and asked him to confine Eleanor more to the White House. And I think he must have had a
What made you interested in writing about her?
Well, I've always been an Eleanor Roosevelt admirer, and I actually grew up in the Hudson Valley, so, you know, very much like a presence. But how I actually came to write this book is I was reading a collection of the My Day columns. And there was the briefest mention that she visited Australia during World War II as part of a tour of the Pacific. And it immediately caught my attention because I had recently been to Australia and New Zealand. And my first thought was amazement at the distance that she traveled to get there and under wartime conditions.
Other questions?
Okay.
What was the most surprising thing you learned about Eleanor in all your research?
I touched on this very briefly, but I was shocked at how forthright she was with the American public. I mean, she did not hold back. And during World War II, you know, she buoyed morale, but she also gave the American public the what for when she thought they needed it. She chastised them for believing Nazi propaganda and told them to stop falling for it like children. You know, in that same speech I referenced, you know, she told them basically to stop whining because she said no bombs are falling on your head. So I was surprised at exactly how forthright she was with everybody.
How long did she travel during which period that she lost 30 pounds?
That was the 5 weeks that she was in the Pacific. Yes. Yeah.
All right, two questions. When did she stop writing My Day, and how did her son survive the war?
All of her sons survived the war, and but you know, she talks about how each time she said goodbye to them, she didn't know if it was going to be for the last time because they saw active duty. You know, they weren't you know, had desk jobs or anything. I know one of her sons' ships that he was on in Italy was bombed. Like I said in the speech, her son James was involved in the Solomon Islands campaign. And how long did she write My Day? So she started My Day in 1936, and she wrote it right almost up until the time that she passed away, which I hope I'm getting the year right, but I think it was 1962. And she only, I think it went down to maybe not 6 days a week towards the end. And I think she only missed a couple of them, and that was after FDR passed away. Questions? Yes?
not a question, but a comment. She said when she went over, she said, "I'm going because people think I should." And when she came back, there was so much controversy because the Republicans accused her of junketeering. She said, she said, "I think Franklin wants me to stay home for a while."
Yeah, and that's interesting, yes. Everything she did generated controversy, and this trip gave, fuel to her detractors. But people also, it was widely reported that she paid her own way and she bought her Red Cross uniforms. So there was also a little bit of disingenuousness going on. And whether the trip was worth her going or how much impact it had, I come back to Admiral Halsey, and the fact that he was against her visit until he saw the impact that she was having. And he said that before she came, after she came, throughout the rest of the war, that nobody else who came through his area did more good than she did, and nothing ever caused him to change his mind after that.
The My Day column, it appeared in newspapers, or where did it appear?
It was syndicated, so it was in a lot of newspapers across the country.
Is it in the collection now, in a book?
Yes, there are one or two collections of My Day columns, but it's like the columns are like this big, and the collection is like this big, which is why there was only one of her time in the Pacific. And that's also partly why I think that this story hasn't been told before, because the scope of Eleanor Roosevelt's life is vast. That's like this, that like her life and what she accomplished, and it was so rich and full that I think her trip to the Pacific tends to get overshadowed within the scope of that rich, full life.
So all those columns that she wrote are not contained within a single book. Is that what you're saying?
No. I mean, there's maybe 8,000 of them. Yeah, there's thousands and thousands of these columns. However, there is a database. It was started by, it's at George Washington University, and there is a database of the My Day columns, and they I don't know if they've all been digitized, but most of them, if not all of them, have been digitized. So you can go into that database. It's anybody can go into it. You can search by keyword, you can browse by date.
So many of us are just learning about this remarkable journey now. What do you attribute that to? The fact that so few of us knew about it?
Yeah, I do just think it tends to get overshadowed. And, even in her biographies, the most recent one came out, Eleanor, by a wonderful book, a man named David McCallis. And, I think it tends to get overshadowed, like within the larger scope of her life. And yet digging layer upon layer upon layer. I spent 4 years researching and writing the book. From initial idea to turning in my final manuscript was 4 years. And it really was like panning for gold. She left behind some narrative things. I mentioned the diary, her My Day columns. They were all crucial resources for me to use. Then I also went, servicemen's oral histories, letters, Red Cross workers, nurses, Admiral Halsey has a memoir. It just tends to get overshadowed, but then plugging away at it and peeling away all these layers and panning for gold, I found, these colorful details that came together to make up the story.
Where was that picture taken there?
That is on Guadalcanal. Yeah.
I feel lucky and really happy I remember that she was on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1958.
Oh my goodness.
It was just so fascinating and mesmerizing, and she sounded so noble and kind, like everybody's grandma, It was just so nice that Ed let her do that.
Yeah, well, you mentioned, she was kind, and I mean, pretty much everything she did in her life was in service of making lives better for other people. She didn't have to do the things that she did. And I think that that's, one of the things that's most extraordinary about her. Sorry.
Shannon, we have your book here at Radnor Memorial Library, and I haven't had a chance, it's probably checked out. I haven't had a chance to look through it, to see the photographs you selected, but I want you to know that my favorite photograph of Eleanor is when she's with the Tuskegee Airmen, and they're taking her out for a ride. I just love that. And it reminds me that we were fortunate, like Lynn says, that Tuskegee Airman Dr. Eugene Richardson, who lives in the Philadelphia area, we also had a few living on the main line. But I remember we had Dr. Eugene Richardson right here in this room where you're speaking.
Yeah, that's really great. That's really
very
extraordinary.
fortunate.
Yeah, so she did. She took a flight, the Tuskegee Airmen. Oh my goodness, you see the picture of this plane, and it's like a tiny plane, and it's all open. Yeah, I mean, it was, and that was one of the things that in my research, I really tried hard to find, and I just did a deep dive into newspaper databases, and I said, I need to find the first time that Eleanor Roosevelt took a flight. And I just used all these various keyword searches in the newspaper databases. And when she was First Lady of New York State, she took her first flight in 1929. And she was asked to christen a plane, a research plane, a laboratory, asked her to christen this research plane. And she said, no flight, no christening. And so she took her first flight that day, it was a ride over Albany.
What age was she when she made this?
She was 58. And she turned 59 the month after she returned.
But was there any concern that she lost I'm back to the 30 pounds. 5 weeks of the First Lady, she's 5 weeks and she's lost 30 pounds. That's a very high.
Yeah, it is. It is. Not that I know of, and knowing Eleanor, she probably just kept on, keep it on. Yeah, I know. It's true. It's absolutely true.
And further to the comment about why wasn't this well, I'm going to say, I think it's part of our education. The World War II was spoken about almost completely in European theater.
Yes.
The Pacific theater is barely mentioned in our American education.
We need to revive.
Yeah, no, I do think, yes, that's true. And that's why, the men on Christmas Island refer to themselves as the island of forgotten men. And Admiral Halsey, and it took a while for the U.S. to ramp up production, but he said that an apt name for the war in the Pacific in the beginning would have been Operation Shoestring.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, we'll go front to back. Okay.
Could you talk a little about Joseph Lash?
Yes, so Joseph Lash thank you for bringing that up, because Joseph Lash was a friend of Eleanor's. He was a young serviceman. Eleanor was friends with both Joe Lash and his fiancée, Trude Pratt. And one of the reasons, Eleanor wanted to visit Guadalcanal anyway, and then she had added incentive because it turns out that Joseph Lash was going to be there at the time that she was there. And, she has this great quote that she says that she saw that, what her presence and meeting all these other servicemen meant, that it might mean even more to Joe, who was also a soldier far from home, to see a friend, to see her familiar face. And she did, so she gets to Guadalcanal, and she and Joe broke protocol. They broke Army protocol by hugging. That wasn't really allowed. And they did get to spend some time together, and she was able to report back to Joe Lash's fiance, what his tent looked like, and all this stuff. But Joe did write to his fiance Trude that he'd never seen Eleanor looking so tired and weary. And this was closing in on the end of the trip. And she did say that the days leaving Admiral Halsey's headquarters, she stopped at 2 islands and then Guadalcanal. And they left at something like 1:30 in the morning for Guadalcanal, that those were the most arduous days of the trip. And she was already 4 weeks in at this point.
Time for one more? Yes.
You mentioned that she had depression when she returned. Did she withdraw for a while? How was that manifested?
Yeah, she found her cottage at Valkill to be a great refuge, and it was very hard for her also to be away from her family and friends. This was the first time that she was on an extended trip without her personal secretary and friend traveling with her. Even when she did her wartime trip to Great Britain, her son was stationed there, she saw him, she had friends there. And so her refuge was, coming home and then reconnecting with her family and friends. And one of the things I found very poignant is that she and FDR exchanged these really lovely notes with each other while she's in the Pacific, checking on each other's health, family members, and making plans to see each other as soon as she got back.
Why didn't they allow someone that was so close to her to go with her then?
Well, she decided not to take her friend and secretary, Malvina Thompson, because she thought it would cut down on the amount of criticism if she just went by herself.
Oh.
Yeah. And also, I think she was to a degree worried about safety because Tommy, Malvina Thompson, her nickname was Tommy. Tommy reported in a letter to a friend that Eleanor had never done this before any of her other trips, but she left her jewelry with Tommy for safekeeping, including her engagement ring. So she had enough trepidation that she left her jewelry behind with instructions on what to do with it if she didn't come back.
And then there may have been more criticism because she took someone along.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and she traveled on a regular military transport, air transport command flight. Everywhere, she was basically hitching a ride. They were always moving air crews, they were taking supplies, they were taking mail. So she was taking up one seat on these, and they did make a slight concession because she traveled in the same transport plane to and back. And they did make a slight concession and they made a bed for her, but it was rarely ever used. It was mostly used for storage.
So we have time for one more question?
I was just going to say, she might not have known how important it could be to have somebody with.
Yes,
She didn't have enough experience to know.
Yeah, and that's also why she was, extra keen to see her friend on Guadalcanal as well, just to see a friendly face and to be so weary at that point in the trip.
But not having been in a war or something, she wouldn't have that.
I have a personal question.
Yes.
What's your next book?
That's a great question. I would perhaps like to write about some of Eleanor's later travels. I just need to find the right hook. And/or Lady Bird Johnson.
Was it Eleanor's idea to go there?
It was both her and the president.
Okay.
The story that she tells us that he asked her to go.
Oh, really?
But I think she'd been hinting around.
Okay.
They both came up with that. And she had wanted to visit Russia and China, but he wanted her to hold off on that. So, I think that was an extra incentive for him to be like, well, why don't you do this instead?
Shannon, thank you again.